Okay, so we're changing gears now, and what we're going to do now is have about 40 minutes or so going through what is happening in the clinical trial space from an industry perspective. So I've got some notes as I change gears from giving a PowerPoint presentation to reading bits of paper. As we heard, this is a very exciting time. I call it a special moment in time, and I wanted to hear from industry experts who are working in this space about what it's like being involved. What can patients expect when they're involved? What are the eligibility criteria and why are there eligibility criteria? What happens after the clinical trial is over? So really go through some of the nuts and bolts of what being in a clinical trial is all about, what is currently happening in this very exciting space, and then really hopefully trying to demystify a lot of the information that's happening right now to try to improve people with CMT with our experts here. So I will formally introduce myself. Josh Burns, clinical scientist at St Jude Children's Research Hospital. We have Dr. Evan Bailey. Evan is Chief Medical Officer at Applied Therapeutics, where he leads the company's CMT SWORD and galactosemia programs. Evan is a board-certified paediatrician. Daniel Brennan, Senior Vice President of Corporate and Commercial Strategy at NMD Pharma. He brings more than 25 years of experience in the pharmaceutical and biotech industries with a focus on rare neurological diseases. Michael Imperial is Program Lead at Actio Biosciences, where he oversees the development of a TRPV4 inhibitor in a phase 1 clinical trial for CMT2C and related peripheral neuropathies. Michael is a biopharmaceutical executive with more than 25 years of global drug development experience. So our plan for today is to give each industry leader a couple of minutes just to describe exactly what they're doing in the CMT trial space. Then we have 3 topics to discuss in a Q&A. What's involved when participating in a clinical trial? What are the requirements to be involved in a clinical trial? And what happens after the clinical trial is finished? And then if we've got some time, we can have some Q&A from the audience. Okay, so let's begin. I think we have some slides. Do I do clicking? Daniel first. You can hop up to the podium or we can bring the clicker over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction and thank you for having me here. I have a slide that I suppose I can hit a button here and it'll show up. Maybe one more. That describes NMD Pharma's, in one slide, as high level as possible, a bit about our study in CMT. So it's called the Synapse CMT study, and I'll kind of start from top down here. This is a phase 2 study. I know Susan was talking about the different phase 1, 2, 3. That means we've completed the phase 1 safety studies, and we've moved on into phase 2 in CMT. And it's a clinical trial to investigate both the safety and the efficacy of NMD 670, which is the name of our drug, in CMT. And we're enrolling patients that are adults aged 18 to 70 with CMT types 1 and 2 and all subtypes of 1 and 2. And it's a 21-day treatment study, so it's relatively short. And I'll tell you a little bit more about each of these aspects of the study. First, starting with what is NMD 670? It's an oral medication, so it's a pill that you would take twice a day, and it is working at the muscle level. So many of the other speakers today were talking about the challenges and the degeneration going on with the motor nerve and the motor axon. Our company is actually taking this from a different direction, and our company was founded by a scientist that actually has worked for decades as a muscle physiologist, and he studies the skeletal muscle and understood that there's a way to be able to amplify signals that are weaker than normal so that the muscle can hear it and actually ultimately improve things like muscle function and strength and endurance. And the company has done studies in preclinical animal models that have shown benefit in CMT on those elements. And now we're moving into our first study, which is the Synapse CMT study in the community. So the objective of the study itself is to try to help patients and to understand, does it help patients improve muscle strength, endurance, and balance in a clinical study setting. We monitor safety on a regular basis, so that is done through the site physicians that are talking with the participants on a regular basis about any adverse events and such, as well as lab tests, and then there's a monitoring board that also reviews all that data. The key measurements, I know that, Josh, you just went over some of these. The primary measurement that we selected out in discussions with the FDA is the 6-minute walk test. So the 6MWT is a 6-minute walk test, and we're hoping to see that there's improvements when people are using our drug versus on placebo or a sugar pill. But we also have other scales involved too. So the CMT-FOM, which is that test of, it's almost like a field test of different muscle strength tests and walking and climbing and hand function, et cetera, that the physician will do at the site at a visit. But then also the CMT high test, which is a questionnaire that is asked to participants to ask them about how do they feel as far as their walking and mobility and such. So the study is nearing completion. We started it a year ago, and I'm happy to say here that we're actually down to the last 3 or 4 patients that need to be screened and enrolled. And so we're still enrolling. If you're interested in more information, please come and see us at the exhibit booth afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Evan Bailey. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Applied Therapeutics. It's really an honor to be here speaking to you about clinical trial design, especially because we have been fortunate to stumble upon, and there really isn't another way of saying it, a specific subtype of CMT for sorbitol dehydrogenase deficiency, or CMT-SORD, which is actually responsive to a very targeted small molecule therapy. So we had already been developing AT-007 or Govorestat for another indication, classic galactosemia, which is a metabolic disease primarily affecting children. And so we already had phase 1 safety data, we had preclinical work, we had all of this. And 5 years ago, someone identified this subtype of SORD, of CMT, that actually is a problem because aldose reductase makes sorbitol, and sorbitol dehydrogenase doesn't work, so the sorbitol builds up in the nerves and causes progressive damage. Now, it's fortunate because within 5 years, we've been able to start a phase 3 study, get the phase 3 study to a point and fully enrolled to the point where we're able to do an analysis after about 12 months of exposure, show that the reduction in the sorbitol levels correlated with some functional endpoints, and that was enough for the FDA and us to have a conversation to say, all right, why don't you go forward with an accelerated approval? And I don't know if you spoke about this earlier today, but to get an accelerated approval means you have to do a confirmatory study. So right now, all the patients who had been in the original study have moved into the open label extension, which means everyone, if they've been on placebo before, are now receiving drug. And this is a study that's both in the US and ex-US. Now, if we get accelerated approval in the United States, that means that the patients here would have it as a commercially available drug to be prescribed. So for a confirmatory study, we actually have to rely on our ex-US physicians, sites, and patients. So we've designed that study to go there. The biggest challenge with designing a study is who to include, how long to do the study, and what to measure. Those conversations are sometimes challenging with the FDA, depending on what division you're in and whether they know about your disease. Now, for us, what we're proud to do is be the first company to go through at this stage with a potential treatment for a subtype of CMT. And this alone can help pave the way for other companies, other industry partners to work with the community, find other targeted therapies, and get it through to approval so that patients can see the benefit. We're also fortunate that we have the benefit of additional safety data from our galactosemia program. So I already know patients who have been on this drug for over 4 years, so I have a good understanding about the safety profile, and then I have an additional data set from the patients who have CMT-SORD for over 2 years. All of this actually helps support an accelerated approval because the risk-benefit ratio that the FDA is looking at is in the right direction, potentially. I can't I'm not going to do any forward-facing statements. So right now we're meeting with the FDA this quarter to discuss next steps for the accelerated approval, confirm that the confirmatory study endpoints are okay, and they're including disease-specific measures that we've spoken about today, the CMT high, the CMT FOM, as well as measuring sorbitol and assessing safety. So I speak quickly, and I think this is about my time. Catherine's giving me the thumbs up, so thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm here on behalf of Actio Biosciences, and we're in the process of developing an oral compound for the treatment of CMT-2C. Okay. We just finished our 1A program, and I think as was mentioned earlier by Sue, the 1A program is a study in healthy volunteers. So in that study, we've completed it. We found it to be safe and very well tolerated. We figured out what our dose should be to go into our next study. So now we're in the process of figuring out what our next study should be. Our next study is going to still be a phase 1 study because we still need additional information about the drug. But in this particular 1B study, we're actually going to enroll patients. So we went from healthy volunteers, which was all positive. There were no health risks or safety concerns that we were concerned about. Now we're going to go into a program, a study, where we're going to have patients with CMT-2C. That primary endpoint, again, will still be safety. However, we're going to be looking for some clinical data that may give us a signal on what perhaps potential endpoints may be for us to figure out a proof of concept. So in that study, we're going to take a look at functional outcomes. We're going to look at, for instance, many of the functional parameters that have been talked about today. But from a patient perspective, we're going to be looking at things like the 6-minute walk test, being able to sit, to come from a sitting position to a standing position. We're also going to be looking, very closely at what happens in different imaging parameters, such as MRI. Earlier today, it was mentioned that they're doing a lot of MRI work, and I think it was Mary Riley and Jasper Morrow in the UK are doing what is called fat fraction MRI. We're going to put that into our next study so that we can see if we see changes in the muscle versus fat ratio. And when we pull all of this together, what we're hoping to do is to be able to get a sense on when we need to do like a pivotal study, a study that we will go to the FDA for approval, what those endpoints should look like. A couple of the other issues, and we really look we speak to patients, we figure out what is most important to patients, and we try to use those scales to build our endpoints, and then figure out what measures we can use to put those into our protocols. One of the other issues that has come to our attention also is many patients with CMT-2C have overactive bladder. So one of the skills we're going to put in there too is to look at overactive bladder in the patient population. So our plan is to work, pull all of this together. We want to be in the clinic in this next study in the first half of next year, the first half of 2026. And then hopefully, depending on what the results of that show, be able to go very rapidly into a phase 2 study. As was mentioned and shown earlier, many times you can have a combined phase 2, phase 3 study. Depending on what our data shows, we are hoping to go down that path with an accelerated approval because it's an unmet medical need. There's no treatment out there at all for CMT-2C. So, we're moving as rapidly as we possibly can, and thus far, we're very, very encouraged with the data that we've had. We also work very closely with Johns Hopkins University. We work closely with Charlotte Sumner. She is running, along with our support, an open, basically a natural history study where we're looking at the natural progression of the disease. That's very helpful for us as we do our interventional studies because we can actually look at the natural progression of the disease versus our study, which is interventional. Thank you.
Thanks. Yep. Okay, I'm going to stand up here so I can see the whole room, and I really want to now get into some specific questions that you might be thinking or learn more information about each of these trials. So it's been excellent to learn a bit more about each of the trials that our industry experts are running. Now we're going to get into the nuts and bolts, into the weeds. So I'm going to ask all of you, and Evan, I'll start with you, and you can either reflect on the past SWORD trial or the upcoming SWORD trial, but really what's involved for the individual when they are in the trial, duration, visits, what's it really like being involved in your trial?
So I'd say it kind of depends on what phase of the study you're in. So phase 3 studies often have a beginning period where there are more frequent visits. So our study, both the one that we've completed and the one that we're planning, you basically go and have a screening visit to see if you're eligible. You perform all of the functional tests. You get your MRI. You fill out the questionnaires. You have physical exams. You get labs to see if you're fully eligible for this study. Like Dr. Burns has said before, sometimes we have to narrow the population a little bit so that the most severe patients don't skew the data, and we actually have the patient population that we're going to see have the greatest chance of seeing an improvement for. It doesn't mean it would work in everyone. It just means we're going to give the trial the best avenue for success. Now, for a disease such as CMT and its different subtypes, it's slowly progressive, which means it's very hard to do a study in 3 to 6 months because the change that you're going to measure on a functional measure or like a patient-reported outcome measure probably isn't going to happen. So you have to plan for a longer study. Based on the Peripheral Nerve Society conference that we were at, we presented data at, for other diseases that are peripheral neuropathies, it looks like it's actually 18 to 24 months before you start to see those effects. Now, in our study, patients did report feeling better with their functioning on the CMT high after 12 months, but their functional measures hadn't quite changed a lot. The other important thing, too, is imaging. As we were talking with Dr. Burns, our patients who had month 24 MRIs, actually, those who were completed looked like they had stabilization of their calf fat fraction, which means it wasn't getting worse. Now, it was a small number of patients, which means when we design our confirmatory study, we're actually designing for it to be 3 years, but we are going to take a look after 2 years to see how the data is going, to see if we can stop it early, because if there's a benefit, we don't want to keep patients on placebo all that time. So for this type of study, there's safety lab monitoring. After those first 3 months, it's usually every 6 months or so. You have to talk to the agency about that, the FDA, and agree to all those things. There's usually monthly phone calls, a diary for taking your medicines. If you experience anything abnormal called an adverse event, you want to report that. So it is something that you have to do, and sometimes there's travel. Because it's a rare disease, we can't have a site in every single city in every single country. So some patients do have to travel or fly to the site to be a part of the study. And depending on the company or how it's set up, we do support those travel.
Thank you. So Daniel, what might you be able to add about what it's really like being in a clinical trial, or in your clinical trial? What's it day to day, week to week, month to month? What's it like?
Well, in our trial, it's a bit shorter. So the trial itself is 21 days, and so it's more on a day-to-day basis. You start off by visiting the site, and as you mentioned, these sites aren't necessarily near where everyone is, so it requires travel. We have a travel program that helps pay for that, but they'll get to the site and they'll be asked questions about how they're feeling and these different questionnaires, as well as the exams. But also we did include, I didn't mention this, a digital wearable device. And so everyone that's into the trial will be educated and trained on how to use this and what to do and what not to do, including not putting it on your dog, let's hope, as you mentioned before. And so then when you go home, you'll have that on you, which is probably a little bit different. There is a diary that's being asked for people to fill out each day. Did they take their pills, and when? Do they feel anything odd or out of the ordinary, like an adverse event? And then after a week, they'll come back for another visit. And so there are several visits that will take place in our case over a short time period of 6 to 8 weeks. You might be visiting that site 6 times. But we have heard patients from our study really appreciating that they're doing something not only bigger than just themselves for the community, but they love meeting with new facility and experts, probably different than their own physicians, that are expert in CMT, and so they look forward to their talks with the staff. They feel empowered, like they're doing something more than, I heard a patient say, I feel like I'm more than a patient. And so, those are some of the kind of interesting side comments that we hear about being involved in the study.
Thanks for that. So, Michael, given you're running a phase 1 study, which really has a focus on safety, can you talk a bit more about the experience of the patient, the visit schedule, how much effort's going into really making sure that the intervention is safe?
So, as I mentioned earlier, we've finished our 1A study, which was shown to be very safe and very tolerable. That study was actually done in a phase 1 unit with healthy volunteers, where healthy volunteers come in, and they're in-house for about 2 weeks while we're testing our drug. But what we're doing now is trying to figure out how do we enroll patients in our next study, which is basically our interventional study with our product, with 0871, which is how we refer to our product at Actio. And what's difficult is it's such a rare disease. There's only about 1,200 CMT-2C patients in the United States. We're going to have maybe 2 sites, and trying to figure out, as my colleagues have said, traveling to those sites, doing the assessments. As we look at these assessments are going to take more than a day. So we've got to figure out how to travel these patients here, stay overnight, figuring out where and how to do all of that. We also plan to enroll pediatric patients. So that's also going to require travel. It's also going to require their families to come with them, because children can't come by themselves. So we're in the process right now of trying to figure out all of those logistics and how that would work, and also how willing are patients willing to do that. And how do we, as a sponsor, make that more appealing, more easier for them, right? And anything we can to make it more comfortable, we're trying to do. One of the things we're looking at is trying to do perhaps maybe more home visits, where we can have basically the healthcare professionals go out to the patient's home and provide some of the assessments that need to be done. Now, it can't happen throughout the whole study, but we may be able to get several of them done at home, which would be much, much less burdensome and much less onerous for the patients. So we're working through all of that to try to figure out the best way to make this convenient and helpful for the patients.
Okay, thank you. We're now going to move on to eligibility. We've heard a little bit already about how not everyone will necessarily be eligible for every trial. So what are the requirements to enroll in a clinical trial? These are often termed inclusion and exclusion criteria. They can be based on CMT type, could be a specific genetic mutation, or it might not be. Also, it could be related to functional ability. How far can you walk? Can you walk? How long can you walk for? Do you wear AFOs? Are you in a wheelchair? So there's different criteria for different trials based on eligibility around function. Some trials are in adults, some are in children, some are in children and adults. And those in children, some start at a certain age. Why is that age selected? And in adults, why is there often an upper limit? What is the physiological basis for there being an upper limit for participants to be involved? And then, there's sometimes questions around surgical history. Have you had foot surgery? And if so, is it, a reconstruction, or is it a tendon transfer? Does that have different meaning for different trials? What about pregnancy? What about taking birth control? All these other types of considerations. Sometimes there's comorbidities, which means, you also have diabetes, or medications. You're also on a medication that might interact with the drug under investigation. So there's a lot of consideration around eligibility. So I'd like to hear from each of our panelists, what is their eligibility criteria? How can they somewhat briefly describe, who's in and who's out? Evan?
So fortunately, ours is pretty focused, so it's simple. You have to have CMT stored. Most of these patients are CMT2 subtypes or distal hereditary motor neuropathy patients who have no diagnosed genetic cause. So you get a urine sorbitol test, first morning void, it's really high. And that's really enough to make the diagnosis if you have all the clinical symptoms. Now, because of genetics, we do try to get genetics, but what we've learned about CMT stored genetics is that it's not a slam dunk. So while most patients have at least one identifiable mutation, you have two, and that second one is often not identifiable. So that's why we use just elevated sorbitol and at least one mutation in our clinical trial requirements. We've also, now that we're going to the confirmatory study and we have other data, we're able to widen our age range. So the original study was 18 to 50 years old. Now that we have more data, we're able to go down to 16 years old and up to 65. We go down to 16, and I'm a pediatrician sitting here with you because it's kind of as low as you can go without really hitting pediatric requirements and pediatric age groups, and that's a whole other thing you have to consider to do pediatric clinical studies. Usually you have to have enough data in adults before you go to kids unless it's only a pediatric disease. So those are the main things for us to consider. As well as with the new study, like Dr. Burns was saying, patients have to be able to produce some sort of force on their dorsiflexion, because that demonstrates that they likely have some movement that we'll be able to observe in the period of time that the study would be conducted. So in terms of exclusion criteria, if you can't generate any force on your dorsiflexion, you would not be able to be in the study.
Thanks, Evan. Daniel, what about your trial? You've got a different eligibility criteria that's really interesting.
Right. In similar fashion, we started out with adults, and that was mainly because that's where the FDA wants you to start before moving into pediatrics with some additional supporting data. So ages 18, but we started with a little bit wider, all the way up to age 70. We hope that will even be able to broaden out in future studies. But so it's ages 18 to 70, and we enroll patients with CMT types 1 and 2, all subtypes, and it's mainly because the target of our disease or our medicine is to work on the muscles and not necessarily the source of why the signal coming in may be weaker. We're actually trying to help the muscles hear a weaker signal, so we believe that we can go across different CMT types, and that's what we've seen in our initial preclinical models, that it could be done as such. One other requirement is that you're able to walk without AFOs and without any assisted devices, the length of the 6-minute walk test. So to be able to do that without any AFOs is part of our inclusion criteria as well. You mentioned some elements about pregnancy. We exclude people that are pregnant. If you're on contraceptives, yes. But if you're planning on becoming pregnant or are pregnant, you wouldn't be allowed into this study until we have further information on the safety for that population.
Okay, thank you. Michael, what about your trial?
Yes, we're looking at, first of all, to come into our study, you have to have the TRPV4 mutation. So we do a mutation analysis. Many times it's already been historically done, but if it's not, we will do that because you have to have the TRPV4 mutation. But in addition to that, you also have to have some sort of neurological symptom because we have to be able to measure something. Some patients that have CMT2C have the mutation, but they really don't have symptoms at that point in time. And if they don't, it's very difficult to bring someone into a program that we don't really have something to measure. So those two things are also important. And then, we're looking at different functional measures. We want them to have a CMT FOM of greater than or equal to 20 when they come into the study. Our age group is from 6 years of age up to 70 years of age. And that's based on non-clinical tox for now. But I would say those are the major inclusion criteria that we're going to have for our first inpatient study.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure you're desperate to know more about non-clinical tox, but we're going to move on. Quick answers, yes or no. Evan, can multiple members of the same family be in your trial?
Yes.
Daniel?
Yes, if they meet the inclusion criteria.
Michael?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I say anything, Josh? Am I allowed to or no? I'm sorry. No, actually, one of the things that we're doing, and one of the things that CMTA is helping us do, is to try to identify members in the same family that may have CMT2C. And I think it's an important aspect. So just wanted to say that.
We'll have another go at a yes or no question. If a participant was in a previous trial, such as the ascorbic acid trial or the Farnex trial or the Acceleron trial, can they be in your trial? Evan?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, nice. Let's move on to the next topic and the final topic, and that's a really interesting one that not always discussed, is what happens after the trial is finished. What are kind of the next steps for the participants and also for the industry sponsor? So I'll ask each of you, starting with Evan, what happens when the trial is over? Will participants stay on drug, and for how long?
Yeah, so for us, we have, like I said, the open label extension where everyone can receive drug if they choose to enroll in that and continue on drug. And we have the stance that you will stay on that until there's an approval, and you'll be able to get a prescription for it and have it, because there is a benefit. You don't want to come off of it. So that's, yeah.
Yep. Daniel?
For our study, after this phase 2 study, you are not able to stay on. So once you complete the 21 days, you would stop. There's a measurement a week later, and that's it. And this is because at the time that we started the design of the study with the FDA, we didn't have the necessary tox and safety data in place to go longer than that amount of time. We've since done so. So in the next study that we do, you'll be able to do that at the end of the study and remain on study drug if you desire.
Michael, what about in the phase 1B?
Yeah, we're in the process of planning an open label extension with the thought that patients would stay on that until commercialization.
Okay, good. So will involvement in your trial prevent participation from a future trial? Are there any reasons that if you decided to be in these trials, that would preclude you from being in a future trial? Evan?
That's not a simple question. It often depends on what the mechanism of action is. So in the case of something like our drug, well, it's still not approved. You really can't go on anything else that's not approved, right? You can only be on one unapproved thing at a time. And then if that does become approved, you have to make sure it's going to be okay to take with the other unapproved drug being studied. So as a hypothetical, if our drug were to become approved and NMD's drug is to become approved, or they have another study where it's not an exclusion to be on our drug, there is a potential that they could be enrolled. So it's a little dependent kind of on the situation, but the bottom rule is you can only be on one thing that's not approved at a time.
Okay. Daniel?
Nothing to exclude you from entering into another trial after ours.
Okay, and also presuming you wouldn't want participants in two trials at once?
Correct.
Okay. Michael?
Yeah, you definitely wouldn't want patients on two experimental therapies at the same time. Now, I will tell you one of the questions that we are getting because we're in early development, and that is if patients are in the 1B program and they're getting our drug, are they eligible for the phase 2 program, right? I get that all the time. And the answer is unfortunately no. We have to bring naive patients into each of those studies. So they wouldn't qualify for another study of ours using our 0871 product.
Yeah, that's very dependent because our patients who did our original dosing study to prove that we could lower sorbitol were eligible, and 8 of the 9 of them actually went into the phase 3 study. So it depends on the program.
And for us, you would be able to go into a subsequent trial. So if you're in the phase 2 study, you could qualify to go into the phase 3 study as well.
So there are key details when and if you decide to participate in a trial as to what happens next. And so that's a very important part of your due diligence when you decide to participate. Let's briefly touch on the regulatory environment. It's really important to do the science. It's also really important to do it in a way that the regulators are accepting. And so if a drug works, it can actually be taken to market and prescribed to people that need it. So Evan, let's start with you. How is your company working with the regulator? In this country, probably the FDA almost entirely, but just generally, how are you working with the regulators? So if the drug works, it can be prescribed.
Yeah, so you have to meet with the FDA before you start a clinical study like this to agree on the study design. So you do that. And then what happens is you have follow-up conversations when you have data and try to figure out the next steps. And one of the biggest challenges is for a rare disease because not everyone in that division knows what your rare disease is or the different aspects of it or how it progresses or doesn't progress. And so they also then don't know the measures necessarily. So one of the challenges that we faced is they said, oh, this is interesting, what's CMT? You educate them on CMT. They say, oh, that's interesting, but what's the CMT high? How do I know it's a good test? And we say, well, it's reliable, it's validated, it's standardized, it's published. They say, how do you know that? Then you have to go back and educate them on the literature. You go back to the test creators. We have the same thing with the CMT FOM. You have to educate them on the disease-specific measures, and they may not like it because people like what they know. So for the neurology division, they know the 10-meter walk-run test. They know the 6-minute walk test. They're like, those are great things. Just use those. But they may not be the right measure for the disease. So it's a lot of education, conversation, and engagement. So I'd probably say that's the biggest challenge right now with the agency. And then from there, you have to check all the other boxes of safety and background data and other studies that had to be done. But it's a continual conversation. And we're not sure right now in today's regulatory climate with all the changes that have been ongoing with the FDA, kind of where each division stands. There's been a lot of turnover. So we take the approach of going with data-driven, educating, reinforcing, and then partnering with the patient community. So I'm going to say that here, mostly with all of you sitting here, because we could do nothing without you or the academic community, all the major doctors who are experts in the field. All three of us have to work together for success, and they want to hear from all three parties, not just from us who did the study. They want to hear from the community as to what's important to them, what's meaningful to them, and they want to hear the same thing from the science and the medicine from all the key expert physicians that are out there. So that's my last piece of that.
Daniel?
In a similar way, we also are required to sit down with the FDA and talk with them about the design of the study and the safety information that we have. It's also very helpful to get alignment and agreement with them before you start a study so that they will value it when it's done. And we very much appreciate the education that you're doing with the FDA on some of these scales and certainly working with CMTA and other patient organizations to help that education because it's difficult in these rare diseases where, like you say, they just don't understand. And they start from a position of, well, we don't believe that it's going to work until you prove it to them. So that's helpful for us. We're very much looking forward to learning from the outcomes of your discussions as we move forward. But you can see in our study, we basically included a number of different measures, assuming that one of those was going to come out at the top of the FDA's list for primary endpoints in a pivotal study.
Michael?
I want to echo, what my colleagues have said, and educating the FDA is a huge hurdle that we all have to do, and it's necessary for us to be able to get these drugs approved.
The one other thing I wanted to add is one of the things that we, I think, all deal with too is biomarkers, right? And when you saw my presentation, the biomarker I'm thinking about is so for fat fraction MRI, we're going to use that as a biomarker. The FDA is fine with you saying it's a biomarker because it is, but they want you to link that to a clinical outcome. So we have to be able to say, oh, look, we've seen this change in an MRI, and you know what? That change in MRI is linked to this patient being able to walk further. So there's got to be a link between those two. And up front, understanding what their expectation is and what they would be willing to accept is important, because that allows us to plan our clinical trial and to make sure we're following it appropriately.
Do we have one or two burning questions in the audience? First hand up over here, and is there a microphone that this young man can have to ask his question? Or I can run him a microphone. We're ready. We've got, yes, good. So one question, and maybe one over this side if there's one, and then we're done.
First of all, thanks for calling me a young man, and thanks for the speakers. And it's really exciting to see all the trials. My question is, how do patients keep on top of other clinical trials that might be coming up or might be in the works? What is the best way for a patient to do that?
CMTA.
Catherine, you want to answer that question?
Yeah, so obviously speaking with your patient representative group is really important because they are good at horizon scanning. And also, going to clinicaltrials.gov, see what's in phase 1, because phase 1 is, good indicator of what's coming next. That's another way to know what's going on. Any other burning questions? Okay, over here, another young man.
I see the 70 age cutoff for one of the slides that was up there. Is that going to be pretty much across the board, do you think, for all clinical trials?
Who wants to answer upper age limits generally, perhaps?
Yeah, I think in general, so the FDA with labeling, so if you have patients who are above the age of 65, they're considered a geriatric population. So if you do study patients, they just ask you to do a sub-analysis and include them in your label for how they did or didn't do. Otherwise, it really is up to the disease pathogenesis, the window for an improvement. So if you have a progressive disease, it's sometimes hard to do a study like including patients who may be older and have more and more disease. So that's often what helps determine kind of the upper limit. It doesn't mean that it's restricted to those age limits when it's approved, though. Generally, when a drug's approved for an adult population, it's 18 plus, and that's just 18 plus if you meet the other requirements. It's just hard in the clinical trial world because you want to make sure you have a population where you can see the true signal of benefit. That's mostly what it determines.
It usually ends up, in addition to that, just really being a company-by-company determination based on what they think their drug can do and how it can work. It usually broadens out. I mean, like we're having discussions right now for our next study to increase the top age to 75 and to go lower into adolescence. And so that just happens at a company-by-company basis with the amount of data that they have for those different populations and those age limits and ranges.
The only thing I might just add to that is the other thing that we look at when we're trying to put age limits on it is safety and understanding the safety profile. And sometimes it's difficult to be able to figure out what a safety profile is and the physiology that changes in people as they get older. So in the clinical trial, sometimes it's a little bit more restrictive, but there's a possibility once we get on the market that would expand.
There was potentially one more. Yes, over here. Do we still have the mic handy? Thank you.
This is for all three of you. Will your medications be affordable and will they be covered by insurance?
Let's start. Evan, Daniel, Michael.
Yeah, so I'll say pricing and reimbursement is a very complex thing. So for me, when I design a clinical study, I want to make sure it contains the information for an insurer to make an appropriate assessment as to whether the drug works. We actually have to start working as companies to educate insurers. So we start meeting with them ahead of time to talk about the study, any initial data we have, give them the scenarios of what the burden of disease is for patients. Because a lot of times they don't understand kind of what the services are, what the surgeries are, what the daily burden is, what restriction on work is as you have a disease that progresses. You may not be able to work. So we have to express all of those things and we start communicating those things to the different insurers ahead of time. And then unfortunately, after that, there's a lot of other factors as to whether or not an insurer will cover it or not. The larger insurers in general for rare disease, we're fortunate in the U.S., they tend to cover them. The smaller insurers, like a farming company in Iowa that only has like a certain number of farmers, sometimes a one rare disease patient's drug would bankrupt them. So those become more challenging. You have to come up with other routes. But it's a very complex situation we have, especially in the U.S. But we do start that work ahead of time to educate, inform, and do analyses as to what the true burden and cost is to the patient and what the benefit is long term.
Okay, briefly, Daniel, anything to add?
Yeah, in order for this to be successful for our investors, we need it to be covered by insurance, and so we have to think about all those things up front. And then I've just worked in rare diseases before. Our company's main goal is to make sure that the cost to the patient is at an affordable level to $10 or less a month. I mean, we have to see how things turn out, and this is in the future for us, but in each of the other cases, we put programs in place to ensure that the patient isn't paying a lot of money.
Okay. Anything to add, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, we're exactly what my colleagues have said. We're in early stage, as I mentioned, we're in phase 1, and we already are looking at health economics and outcomes and using that to try to make sure that at the end, this is actually affordable.
Okay, I am hoping you found this panel informative. I think we're at the beginning of a conversation with industry, and I think that next time we'll have even more questions and more panelists and more exciting developments to talk through. I really wanted today to, really get into the weeds and hear a bit more from our industry experts about, what it's like and what we can expect, and then for you to all think about, if you're going to be involved in a trial, what are some of the questions you need to ask and what some of the information you need to find out. So please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for being here today. And I'm now going to ask Catherine to come up on stage and get on to the next part of the session. Thanks very much, everybody.